And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Benjamin Handelman of CrossTheTiber.org, talking about translating the faith so that non-Catholics can understand. And, you know, Benjamin, the point you made right at the end of the break was an important one in that even from denomination to denomination, you run into these oddities with language, right? Because a sacrament would mean something very different for an Anglican than it would for a Baptist, if it means anything, or for especially like other words as well for other groups, Seventh-day Adventist, Jehovah's Witnesses. You do have to know all the different permeations of what to say and what not to say.
Sure. I mean, one of my favorites is understanding the real presence. Now, for Catholics, it's complicated enough in a sense, right? I feel like once you understand it, it makes sense. But there's a lot we have to explain transubstantiation. We have to explain what accidents are. We have to explain what substance is in that context. When you go to the Protestant side, there's several understandings of the real presence. If you go up to James White and ask him, do you believe in the real presence in the Eucharist? He would affirm it. He's got like a whole sermon series. It's about 6 hours long it's only 4 sermons, but it's 6 hours long, explaining his understanding of the real presence and why he affirms it. But when you really drill down and listen, it's something completely different than what a Catholic would affirm. The Calvinist understanding is something akin to, well, Christ is present in a special way spiritually, but he's not physically present because he's sitting in heaven at the right hand of the Father. So it's not, he's not present in the Eucharist in a sense of like he's present inside it. He's not present with it. But spiritually, he's more present when Christians share communion. An Anglican will believe potentially, again, because even in Anglicanism, right? The Anglican Union, there's so many different factions and pieces of it. But at least some of the more popular, more commonly encountered ones in the United States, believes in a form of consubstantiation where the bread and wine are still bread and wine, but that Christ is also present in the bread and wine. And that's different from the Lutheran understanding of consubstantiation, which is that the bread and wine are still bread and wine, but are also turned into the body and blood of Christ, but not in the same way as transubstantiation. And I can't break that down for you because I honestly would need to spend several hours trying to understand it myself. So I don't want to I don't want to badmouth them for their understanding, but I'm just saying they're even using some of the same terms to mean different understandings of their beliefs. And so when we don't translate that, if I go talk to a Baptist about the real presence, I need to be very clear and start explaining accidents and substance and all of these things, explaining about why we believe it's not just a symbol, but it's actually transformed into the body and blood. If I'm talking to an Anglican, I may not need to explain some of those terms, but I may need to explain why, no, not just present in the Eucharist, but the Eucharist is transformed into. It makes the conversations very different, can affect your ability as an apologist to be able to communicate. If you get this really bad, that can close the doors. Another great example, in my opinion, is Jehovah's Witness and Seventh-day Adventist. So both of these groups descend from a 19th century group called the Millerites. I don't want to go too in depth because you don't have a 9-hour show, but the Millerites were basically an apocalyptic group. They believed the end times are going to happen at some point in the near future. For some of the members of the audience that are approaching our age, maybe they'll remember Hal Lindsey, for example, or even Chuck Smith felt guilty of this, the founder of Calvary Chapel. So when the apocalypse didn't happen, there was no second coming, his followers splintered. So 90% of them became atheists because they were horribly disappointed. A group of them became not the Quakers, I believe it's the Shakers. And I'm not overly familiar with these groups because they're not anywhere in the western part of the United States. Then a group became the Jehovah's Witness, who are non-Trinitarian. And then a group of them splintered off and began to follow Ellen G. White and became the Seventh-day Adventist. Now, the Jehovah's Witness and the Seventh-day Adventist, most of your listeners will have heard of and probably encountered fairly regularly. I regularly get Seventh-day Adventist literature left on my door. I enjoy some of it. It's very interesting. It's very difficult to read. And Jehovah's Witness, we see them riding around all over the place. They often can be mistaken for Mormons and how they go door to door and wish to talk about their faith with you. So these two groups, they have a very similar belief that Michael in the Old Testament and Jesus are the same person, the same creature, the same being. Mm-hmm. They have a very important distinction between the two. Jehovah's Witness believe that Jesus is Michael, that Michael incarnated, and that's who Jesus was. Seventh-day Adventists believe that Michael is actually a pre-incarnate form of Jesus, that it's a title for him because Michael has a specific meaning in Hebrew, and Michael is the Prince of Jerusalem. Therefore, Jesus is the Prince of Jerusalem. So Michael is just an example of a Christophany, I believe is the term. Mm-hmm. That is a very different claim between the two. You can reasonably argue the Seventh-day Adventists are Trinitarian Christians, and if they incorrectly believe that the Archangel Michael is a Christophany, that's a very different argument than Jesus is not God, but in fact the chief archangel. And if you're having a conversation with the Seventh-day Adventists and you mistake them and their belief for being equivalent to Jehovah's Witness, they will get incredibly offended, believe you're ignorant, that you didn't look into their beliefs at all, and then why should they even bother talking to you? And then all those things that they've always been told about, because their church is very anti-Catholic and always has been, they were right. Of course, this person just assumed I was a heretic that doesn't believe that Jesus is our risen Lord. Doors closed. So those conversations and those translations are so important to us. There's really basic things that I wish were, I wish there was an easy list, right? Like, here's the list of all the phrases that a Baptist will use that sound familiar, and here's what they mean so you understand and can translate. We did a previous episode. If someone were to go like subscribe to your podcast on Apple, podcasts, and they go all the way back and review all your episodes on iTunes, so you get some extra reviews and comments, they'll find an episode where I talk to you about, are Catholics born again? And we can say, yes, we are. But there's caveats there, because we have to, what does born again mean? What is being said in that passage? What else is mentioned in that same passage as being born again? It's baptism. It's very clear. Born of water and of spirit. It's baptism. But we have to have that conversation with evangelicals. Some evangelicals believe, for example, when it says born of water and spirit, being born of water, when you're born, your mother's water has to break. And that's what it means to be born of water. That's an anachronistic and impossible understanding of the passage. If you know anything about how the ancient Near East understood birth and understood and phrased these things, that is not how they would have understood that passage. Water and the Spirit, right after we're discussing baptism, probably related, probably talking about baptism, which uses water, especially when we compare it to what's said in 1 Peter, what's said in Acts. But we have to know these things. We have to understand them. And conversely, unfortunately, there's not a list to say like, oh, well, Protestants don't have confirmation. They don't have anything like confirmation. So you have to start from scratch and go, okay, well, here's this passage in Acts, and here's what's happening when they're laying on hands, and here's why this is a sacrament, and here's why it's important. Marriage. We affirm not only Protestant, any marriage, right? A natural marriage between a man and a woman, natural law. The Catholic Church may need to affirm it if you become Catholic. But if you are married as Muslims and you have children and then you convert with your wife, that's still a marriage. We still recognize the beauty of that marriage. There's encyclicals and encyclicals upon this topic. But marriage between Protestants and Catholics doesn't quite mean the same thing, because if it's not a sacrament, then how else does that impact marriage? Is it instituted by Christ? Well, I've talked to evangelicals that say, well, no, marriage existed before the incarnation, and therefore Jesus is just affirming marriage as a good thing, but it's not something he's instituting. Well, then we can start looking on the teachings on divorce, right? Because if this is not an institution started by Christ himself, then maybe it's not really important if you stick with it. Maybe, so I don't want to, it's not like evangelicals will say divorce is good or that you should just do this and go have 6 marriages, but it starts to erode the foundation of where those understandings lie. So many evangelicals will tell you, oh, only in the case of fornication, because they're looking at the passage in Matthew. But some, it starts to stretch further, and they'll start saying, well, that's an example of a type of marriage that can be declared invalid. But it's not the only example. Like, what about abuse? And to be clear, if you are in an abusive relationship, you should not be living with that person. You should be getting help. And then you need to talk to your diocese about your marital situation. But we believe that marriage is a permanent thing that happens between a man and a woman. They become one. If you don't believe it's instituted by Christ, it becomes more difficult to argue this. The confession, the sacrament of penance, or reconciliation. If this is not something that's instituted by Christ, why is it important when you can just pray to God? Why would you do this thing? And sure enough, I mean, I know that technically the Lutheran Church has confession of some sort. I don't know anyone that's used it before, so I can't speak to it, but it's certainly not a forgiveness of sins as we would understand it.
Right. Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Benjamin Handelman of CrossTheTiber.org, and we're talking about translating the faith for our separated brethren. More to come right after this. Stay tuned.